Opening the center immediately, this push contests central squares and liberates diagonal lines for your king's bishop. Boldly contesting the center, Sicilian defense immediately challenges white's pawn's influence and sparks asymmetrical pawn structures. Instantly contesting central pawn presence and preparing queenside development creates immediate dynamism. Solidifying the center and preparing for a robust pawn structure, this choice immediately embraces the Sicilian's asymmetrical spirit. A probing bishop now tests the king's safety, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure. Developing the knight to d7 defends the bishop on c5 and prepares to castle, a solid defensive setup against white's early aggression. Opening the center now creates immediate dynamism, challenging black's pawn structure and fighting for central space. Opening this central file decisively, black embraces the tactical realities of the Sicilian dragon's early skirmishes, sacrificing pawn structure for active piece play. Reclaiming central pawn presence, the queen immediately exerts pressure, eyeing weak squares and controlling vital diagonals. Challenging the bishop's dominion over the center forces it to retreat, but also invites potential weaknesses on the queen side. Exchanging that bishop opens up the d-file for black's queen, potentially creating early attacking pressure. White sacrifices a piece for initiative, hoping the open lines will prove more valuable than the material deficit. Recapturing the bishop strategically repositions the black queen, opening a vital diagonal for her influence and preparing for central pawn advances. Establishing central presence while preparing for kingside development, this knight elegantly seeks control of key squares and aims to support a pawn push. Challenging the center, black immediately confronts white's knight and opens lines for their own pieces, a bold attempt to seize initiative in this dynamically unbalanced Sicilian Najdorf variation. The queen retreats, safeguarding against the immediate pawn advance while preserving a slight outpost on d3 for potential future advances or a repositioning. Asserting control over the open c-file, this maneuver immediately challenges white's queen and aims to activate the rook from its passive starting square, creating active counterplay. Securing the monarch is paramount now, tucking it away from potential central threats as the game opens up. Securing the queen from immediate threats and preparing to contest the central files, this maneuver subtly shifts the game towards a more positional struggle, hinting at future pawn breaks in the center. A flexible retreat for the knight, aiming to reroute it to a more active square, perhaps f3 or even e4, while reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for potential pawn breaks. This repositions white's knight to avoid immediate complications and seek a better strategic platform. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal, and preparing to challenge the queenside control after the earlier pawn exchange aims to disrupt white's harmonious piece placement and potentially prepare a kingside pawn storm. Reclaiming the d-file with the rook signifies white's intention to dominate this crucial open conduit, potentially pinning black's queen or applying pressure down the line if it remains. Preparing to join the central skirmish, the bishop relocates to a square where it can offer support for its king and survey the d7-g4 diagonal. White's bold assertion on the queenside aims to restrict black's bishop on d7 and potentially initiate a pawn storm, though it does leave the b4 square vulnerable and might overextend if black can exploit it. Instilling dynamism into the knight's position, this maneuver aims to challenge the established central control and potentially disrupt white's coordinated pieces, hinting at future kingside pressure. Repositioning the knight to f1, while seemingly passive, aims to reroute it to a more influential square, perhaps g3 or e3, to support the kingside or challenge black's pawn structure, thereby offering greater flexibility for future maneuvers. This aggressive queen sortie, qc4*, immediately challenges the central control and aims to disrupt white's harmonious piece development, particularly targeting the somewhat exposed king's side. e3 redirects the knight from an exposed central square to a more secure outpost, eyeing the c2-g6 diagonal and preparing to support a potential kingside pawn advance. Exchanging queens here simplifies the position considerably, leading towards an endgame where black's central pawn structure has some weaknesses. But white's knight on e3 is still somewhat awkwardly placed and could become a target. Exchanging the queens simplifies the position, shifting the focus to white's efforts to exploit black's slightly passive pawn structure and potentially activate the rook on the d-file, while black will aim to neutralize white's central influence and find active squares for their pieces. Sensing a shift, black repositions the knight to d7, aiming to free the c-file for potential pawn advances or rook activity, while also preparing to redeploy the knight to a more active square like e5 or f6, potentially putting pressure on white's somewhat exposed king. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for future kingside expansion, though it subtly weakens the light squares around the monarch. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure now prevents potential weaknesses, preparing for a more dynamic middle game by reinforcing the f7 square and creating a more robust defensive shell. Unleashing a knight towards the center aims to exploit black's slightly passive knight placement, potentially forcing concessions or creating attacking opportunities on the kingside. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside now, black aims to disrupt white's central stability and create immediate complications. Exposing the f-file, white gambits a pawn to open lines and disrupt black's pawn structure, creating opportunities for piece activity and a potential kingside attack down the newly freed file. Capturing the pawn creates a dynamic pawn structure. Black has gained central presence, but the open f-file now offers white attacking possibilities later, potentially targeting the weakened kingside. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside, white aggressively pushes f4, aiming to shatter black's pawn structure and seize control of the central squares. This bold advance creates immediate tactical complications, potentially opening lines for white's rooks and queen. Observe how this pawn thrust drastically alters the pawn geometry, forcing black to carefully consider their defensive responses and any counterplay they might launch. The game now enters a phase where tactical awareness and precise calculation will be paramount, as white's initiative hinges on the success of this aggressive pawn lever. Black's pawn advance to e4 injects crucial dynamism into the position, aiming to seize initiative by disrupting white's central structure and creating new attacking avenues. Strategic insight. This bold pawn push is a double-edged sword, potentially opening lines for black's pieces while simultaneously weakening the d5 square and the pawn chain on the kingside. It's a declaration of intent to complicate matters and create counterplay, forcing white to react precisely. Initiating the rook to a semi-open file, white aims to pressure black's d-pawn and prepare for potential pawn breaks or piece transfers, a classic maneuver in this type of Sicilian structure where central control is paramount. Exploring the newly opened e-file, black's bishop relocates, abandoning its previous outpost on e7 to engage in the positional skirmish, eyeing the critical d3 square and the d6 pawn, a subtle nod towards preparing a potential kingside advance by the g-pawn. Solidifying the queenside structure against black's encroaching pawn mass is the priority, creating a stable platform for future operations while preventing any immediate queenside breakthroughs. Asserting control of the e4 square now that white's knight has retreated allows black to consolidate his central presence and prepare for future pawn advances, potentially opening lines towards white's potentially vulnerable king. Reinforcing the central pawn chain aims to restrict black's knight mobility. Shedding the knight on d5 initiates a complex strategic shift, aiming to alleviate the pressure black's pieces were exerting and unlock the c-file for potential counterplay, while simultaneously creating a more open structure where the bishop pair might eventually become a factor if white isn't careful. Clearing the central files for potential rook activity, white initiates a bold redeployment of the knight, aiming to activate it on a more commanding square after black's exchange on d5. This maneuver not only prepares for future pawn pushes, but also subtly probes black's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses that can be exploited in the ensuing middle game. This piece relocation immediately challenges white's bishop, aiming to disrupt its influence and potentially open lines for black's rooks. It sets up a tactical skirmish, forcing white to reevaluate their piece placement and consider the implications for central control. Black is proactively seeking counterplay and aiming to exploit any potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure or king safety by activating their queenside pieces. Reclaiming the open d-file aims to centralize the rook and prepare for potential exchanges or maneuvering on that critical central corridor, subtly challenging black's bishop's influence. Mobilizing the monarch adds a layer of active defense and potential counterplay, shifting the focus from passive piece development to king safety and central influence. Aimed at solidifying the kingside and preparing for potential pawn advances, this bishop maneuver strategically repositions the piece from an open diagonal to a more defensive square, offering support to the central pawn structure and restricting black's knight's potential entry points. Redirecting forces to the queenside suddenly feels less pressing as black shifts focus towards the center, aiming to consolidate piece activity before white solidifies their queenside pawn structure. Relocating the king to the second rank shuffles the deck, subtly reinforcing the kingside and preparing for potential pawn pushes in the center or on the queenside, even as black's pieces, particularly the bishop on a5, seem poised to cause trouble along the long diagonal. Preparing to challenge the open c-file with the rook is a logical step, aiming to exert pressure and potentially disrupt white's central control. Securing the kingside pawn structure against potential knight incursions forms the immediate priority. This defensive redirection subtly seeks to consolidate pieces and anticipate potential pawn pushes, aiming to reinforce the kingside structure that might become vulnerable if the bishop retreats further. Stepping back to protect the weak pawn structure on the queenside, white aims to consolidate and prepare for a potential queenside advance. Solidifying the pawn chain's base and preparing a potential kingside expansion, this maneuver aims to create breathing room for the pieces and deny white's knight any easy outpost. Clearing the path for the queen's knight to penetrate the queenside presents an interesting tactical twist after black's recent passive repositioning of their rook. A daring repositioning, the bishop now seeks diagonals on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's piece coordination and potentially prepare for a future queenside pawn advance. Opening the c-file with this capture immediately disrupts black's pawn structure, creating a potential avenue for your rooks to exploit on the open file. An opportunistic capture that rips open the king's defenses, creating immediate tactical havoc by bringing a fresh attacker to bear on the exposed monarch. The knight repositions to d4, a central outpost that immediately pressures black's advanced pawns and eyes the b5 square, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially activate the knight further. Shifting the bishop to that diagonal creates significant attacking pressure, aiming to pry open the kingside by threatening a fork on the knight and potentially disrupting white's pawn structure. Recapturing the knight on d2 immediately secures white's pawn structure and reestablishes a strong central presence, while simultaneously preparing to bring the rook into more active play along the now open d-file. Reclaiming the attacked bishop immediately resolves a tense situation, though it gifts white a clear advantage in controlling the d-file with their rook and knight duo. Reclaiming the rook with the intention of centralizing it, this maneuver aims to regain lost initiative and potentially create new attacking pathways, especially considering the awkward placement of black's bishop on the queenside, now somewhat sidelined by its prior excursion. The rook reroutes to the c-file, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially create counterplay against the d-pawn. This pawn advance aims to restrict black's bishop and potentially create a passed pawn later on the queenside, while also opening a pathway for white's king to reach the queenside should the need arise. Sizing up the open b-file, black aims to activate their rook and potentially create threats on that flank, but it risks weakening the pawn structure on the queenside. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure prevents further infiltration and prepares for a potential queenside expansion once the minor pieces are better positioned. Consolidating the king on a more secure square like e7 allows for better defense against potential pawn advances and prepares for future maneuvering, aiming to centralize it for the endgame. Shifting the monarch towards the center now seems paramount, preparing for a potential endgame where king activity becomes a critical weapon. Shifting the king to d7 solidifies its position on a relatively safe square, preparing to bring it into the fray to support the remaining pawns and potentially contest the open files. Opening up a new avenue for the bishop to harass the queenside pawn structure, this move aims to disrupt black's defensive setup while preparing for potential central pawn advances, aiming to exploit the slight lack of coordination on black's kingside, where the pieces are somewhat passively placed. Expanding the queenside pawn structure with b5 aims to gain space and potentially create a passed pawn, but it weakens the dark squares around black's king and offers a hook for white to attack on the queenside. A bold territorial claim on the queenside, aiming to restrict black's bishop and prepare an advance of the b-pawn to seize more space. Capturing the pawn opens a critical file for your rook and creates a passed pawn on the queenside, a potentially dangerous weapon if you can support it effectively. Sacrificing the rook here exploits the exposed black king, forcing a critical decision that will define the endgame's character by either simplifying into a winning material advantage or allowing a desperate counterattack. Relinquishing the rook on d6 to reclaim the bishop on b3 seems like a desperate attempt to gain material back, but it opens up the d-file entirely and leaves your own king exposed to further threats from white's active pieces. The pawn advance cracks open the e-file, creating an immediate threat to the black king and potentially opening avenues for white's remaining pieces. The bishop's maneuver to the queenside offers a desperate attempt to create counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's neatly organized pawns and potentially threaten the d-file. However, it comes at the cost of abandoning its strong central outpost on a5, which was effectively pinning down white's knights. This sacrifice might lead to temporary complications, but white's material advantage and superior pawn structure in the center still heavily favor them. The hope here is to generate chaos before white can consolidate and march their passed pawns to victory. Repositioning the monarch towards the center now becomes a priority for white to navigate this pawn-heavy endgame and exploit any potential weaknesses in black's structure. The black king, now exposed in the center after the exchange of queens and rooks, finds itself a beacon for white's remaining pieces. Preparing to reinforce the kingside pawn structure establishes a more resilient defensive barrier against any potential black counterplay aiming towards the monarch. Recognizing the opportunity to consolidate forces and prepare for the upcoming pawn push, black repositions the bishop to a more supportive role. A calculated advance, king steps into the fray, preparing to shepherd the pawns toward the queenside, aiming to solidify the structure and potentially launch a decisive pawn storm. Securing the king in the center offers a fleeting moment of perceived safety, but leaves it exposed to potential swarms of enemy pieces. Consider how your monarch might become a target for centralized pressure in the coming exchanges. Fortifying the queenside pawn chain with this bishop repositioning aims to shore up white's defenses against further black incursions through the center. Hoping to exploit the pawn structure weakness on the queenside, black pivots the king towards the action, aiming to support the isolated c-pawn and potentially create counterplay along the newly opened diagonals. Abandoning the active bishop for a king that seems poised to become a powerful central force marks a shift towards a simpler, pawn-driven endgame where white aims to leverage their connected passed pawns. The defender's king finds itself in a precarious central position, now actively seeking refuge, which is a testament to the opponent's successful pawn advance that has opened up critical lines. Pushing the pawn forward creates new attacking avenues, aiming to destabilize black's pawn structure and gain a foothold on the kingside, potentially opening lines for the rook or bishop. Releasing the pawn on g4 offers a surprising opportunity to activate the rook, now free from its defensive duty and poised to penetrate along the open sixth rank, potentially creating significant problems for white's king and exposed pieces. Opening the kingside to expose the enemy king is the primary objective now. The pawn push opens a diagonal for the rook to potentially penetrate, but it leaves the king exposed, a tempting target in this tense middle game where piece activity is paramount. The king's new central role in this endgame is now officially cemented, pushing its way towards the heart of the board to support its pawn structure and menace the opposition. The black king, now exposed, becomes the focal point of white's immediate attention. Pushing the pawn forward here aims to create a passed pawn, a dangerous weapon in the endgame, by driving away the black bishop and potentially opening lines for white's king to join the attack. Challenging the central pawn structure, black aims to create complications and disrupt white's newly established pawn majority. The pawn advances, a desperate surge against the encroaching darkness threatening white's king. The bishop repositions to g6, intending to contest the crucial f-file that white's advanced pawn now controls, aiming to disrupt white's attacking potential and perhaps offer a pawn sacrifice to open lines for counterplay should white take the bait. Relocating the monarch to this central square aims to activate it for the endgame, potentially becoming a powerful piece for attacking pawns and supporting its own advance. Pushing that pawn creates a new passed threat and forces white to actively defend its king, potentially disrupting its coordinated pieces. The bishop retreats, its attack on the pawn chain now diffused, seeking a safer position to observe the unfolding drama of the now open kingside. Opening up a new pathway for the rook to potentially infiltrate the queenside is the immediate objective of this pawn push.